Imagine fronting up at the office of PKW. You don't know who you are, you don't know how you connect, you don't know...
I don't know who they are, what they even represent.
Māori data analytics team at Victoria University and in collaboration with the University of Auckland are working at the interface between Mātauranga Māori and data science.
Our project's vision is to provide tools so that PKW can help its shareholders on their journey of discovery, rediscovery and connection.
1963 saw an amalgamation of 22,000 hectares that resulted in a mega reserve by the Crown. Whakapapa links to whenua was severed, leaving whānau alienated and disenfranchised. In 1976, Paranene Hiki Waitotara, the Taranaki-based landing corporation, became kaitiaki of the whenua.
My nan is a shareholder and my great-grandparents were both original shareholders when PKW was established in 1976.
PKW manage a database of 10,000 shareholders, yet the whereabouts of only 40% are known.
We're trying to exactly connect some little pieces of the data in LINS with some little pieces of the data in Māoriland Online.
The thing that really excites me is this important piece of the machinery where we need to relate sets of names together, one name to another name, and the question is, are these possibly the same person or not?
We're trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
Kimi e te matangaro, reconnecting whānau to whenua.
Well, kia ora koutou. Welcome to this second stream of the afternoon. I'll hand over very quickly to Sydney, Rhys and Rere-No-A-Rangi, but I wanted to welcome you all and welcome them. Thank you for that opening video there. So, kia ora koutou.
Ko hea tērā maunga e tū maira. A ko taranaki pea, neke mai, nuku mai, taku tauaro, kiki ni ai. Ke no. Tēnā tātou, tēnā koutou e ngā kai whakarongo. Kia mātou nei i tēnei wā, me te mei au ki ngā mana wenua, o tautai, Ngāti. Ngai tau, tēnā koutou, anō rā, tēnā tātou ko Rere-No-A-Rangi tōku ingoa, anei a taranaki e mi atu nei. Kia ora rā.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Rhys Owen. Here I am.
Kia ora tātou, ko Sydney Shep, tāku ingoa, he kaiwhakahere o Waitiata Press, te whareta o Waitiata o te Rere-No-A-Rangi, Victoria University of Wellington. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Ka pai. We'll start with you, Rhys.
We're going to dive straight into it. This is a web app we call Roku. It starts out with a name. The name Owen in this case. It's initially searching a 150,000 triple store. Built with PKW data, Paranene Waitotara data. Their register, their shares transfer schedule, and notes data from those two registers. Any of the identifiers that are found in that search, such as a minute book reference, are then used to make a second search in a very large triple store of 350 million triples that we've built out of Māoriland Online and historical births, deaths and marriages. To complete that large triple store, we've added sets where we've been able to make inferences, where we've been able to infer siblings, perhaps out of births where the parents' names are exactly the same, in MLO, where the succession is the same in terms of land block shares and minute book hearings. So we've got our primary data, and then we've got these sets, and we add some more sets where we can infer that sets are actually the same. So this is giving us linkages across from historic births into MLO sibling sets. And we've added a few more sets for MLO owners where we've used maiden and married name information in MLO to tie us across to a marriage certificate. So we search a name in the PKW data. That search returns us some identifiers. We take them across into a much larger triple store. That lets us pull back hopefully relevant information. A tiny piece of a very large triple store is returned that's hopefully relevant to the PKW data that started the process off. So this is really our first try at a tool for PKW that uses a part of the PKW graph, the PKW social network, as a window into an enormous trove of New Zealand historical data. And our colleague Marcus Freehan, who you heard at the end of Pikihuia's marvellous video, has been working on name similarity as part of a major reworking along Bayesian lines of our inference. And we're hoping that that's going to smarten up the windows quite considerably. But the name Boylan comes from Rere's whānau, and I'll hand back to him to look at this particular example that we see here.
Aye, very Māori name, Boylan. Yes, so just to kind of reiterate what we've seen on the right-hand side here is our kind of window, which is these are my grandmother's brothers and sisters, and a succession here, her mum, my great-grandmother, and who she has moved to her brother's children. And then, as we can see over here, we've got a record. This minute book reference ties us to other records we can find elsewhere in the kind of big, enormous graph. So ways that we can effectively, as Rhys is saying, to kind of shrink that window down a little bit further. What else have we got? Can't find. All right, let's go back to the slides. Let's go to the slideshow. So just to reiterate some of the kōrero that Pikihuia shared, the name of the talk is looking for Maori land, but as you can kind of start to imagine, that looking for land and looking for people and looking for names and looking for historical records, they definitely intersect. So the amalgamation of this area of Taranaki, or this Paranini ki Waitotara, Paranini in the south, in the north, Waitotara in the south. That amalgamation, as Pikihuia put it, severed whakapapa ties to land. So anyone who was originally an owner down in Waitotara, just north of Wanganui, was part of a major shareholder, a major estate, and they had part shares in any land reaching all the way up to Paranini. So one thing that this did do is allow for the public trustee to make it easier for them to sell Māori land, and we can at the time that PKW took on the West Coast Settlement Reserves, I think it was around about 5% of the original confiscations, everything to the west of the Blue Line, 5% was returned. The vast majority of these blocks were under perpetual lease when they were returned to PKW. So even though we were still owners, we weren't able to walk on that land. And that's been the case for some whānau since 1860s, which I guess speaks to that further story of disenfranchisement that Pikihuia was talking about. So one approach that we had, or one idea that we had was, how can we figure out who connects to which block of land in Taranaki? Because PKW were given a whole bunch of records and there was no particular way to figure out who connects to which block of land. So here we have just a little app, Mahere. That's a pretty boring name, Mahere map. You kind of get the idea. This effectively, it lets us put in a title and we can have a look at any information about the name of a block, particularly because the importance of that is because for a lot of these blocks that have been divided and cut up over time or amalgamated and then cut back up again, a lot of the old names have been lost, and a lot of these old names carry with them a lot of the stories of who and where used to live there, and which all kind of feeds into this idea of helping people reconnect, more kōrero, more stories to carry through. So yeah, section 370 was, I think, the name of this block for decades, and so through being able to look through old LINS data, we're able to pull apart some of these old names that have been lost from the general memory of or at least administratively, and some they still exist in the hearts and minds of some of our tauweke, but a lot of those names have been lost, unfortunately. We must acknowledge Matt Briggs and Maps Past for most of this work with the historical maps. We've just kind of taken what he's got and put it on the screen. And just the ability to overlay current geometric information on top of historical maps is just amazing. And it also, one example here is this particular map over here. If you can see Port Takataka is puna, that a wellspring that a well-known princess or well-known tupuna from about the 16th century Ruaputahanga would go here, and that was her spot. I didn't actually know where it was. I'd known all the stories about this woman and the significance of this place, but I've never actually known where it was until I came across this old historical map. So some of these stories that carry through in these historical maps and the lands, you can start to imagine this feeds into this wider conversation around connection.
So we joined an existing project that was in a form of what Linda Tuawai Smith has called helicopter research. That is grabbing other people's data, computing with it, and delivering the results. We had to begin again. We had to mend old relationships. We had to build new ones for meaningful engagement. Our relationship with PKW was transformed from data providers to research collaborators and community connectors. Our initial discussions with LINS, Land Information New Zealand, turned into an amazing Te Tiriti-based Mana Oriti agreement. Under Article 2 of the treaty, we were given free access to our data, a dedicated liaison person, LINS in-house expertise, and a voice in the bespoke digitization of over 350 Taranaki role plans and maps. This relationship with LINS has not only propelled our research exponentially, but has also opened up new potential mahi and collaborations such as with the New Zealand Geographic Names Board. These opportunities would not have come to fruition if we did not have an equal commitment to building capability. As we know, Māori Pacifica and women are seriously underrepresented in STEM. However, we've taken a different approach. It's noteworthy that the project has attracted a diverse range of participants from outside the traditional STEM disciplines, drawing from history, linguistics, law, political science, information management, economics and finance, cultural heritage, and digital humanities. This reflects the complexity and richness of the research problem, as well as the necessary humanities domain skills to help solve it. Moreover, it reflects an interdisciplinarity that is at the core of Kopapa Māori research in the world of Te Ao Māori, where everything connects. Rather than jumping in to recruit researchers with technology skills, we opened korero with Rere-No-A-Rangi and created capability pathways for those who have a connection to the whenua and a passion for the mahi. So someone like Rere started as an intern, became a research assistant, and now leads one project stream. And we'll hear from Pikihuia shortly as she shares her PhD mahi, developed on the back of a research assistantship in the project. At the end of the day, technology is in the service of the Kopapa, and delivering meaningful results include sustaining meaningful intergenerational relationships that will continue well beyond the funding horizon. Now, working within Indigenous paradigms requires a profound flax roots rethinking of community collaboration, research design, and computational approaches. Rupika Rizam explains the Digital Humanities diversity agenda has occluded the need for a greater self-awareness of the field's own colonizing theories and practices. The dominant narratives of digital humanities driven by the global north relegate Indigenous perspectives, positionality, and practices to subaltern status and deny agency. They have also derailed deep engagement with decolonizing the production of knowledge. She advocates for the creation of new methods, tools, projects, and platforms to undo the epistemic violence of colonialism and celebrate the hybridity, plurality, contradiction, and tension that are the necessary strategies of decolonization. The research journey of our New Zealand National Science Challenge project has highlighted several key questions. Are the computational tools and techniques developed for predominantly Western or European digital humanities compatible with Indigenous worldviews, languages, and practices? Are the philosophies and methodologies underpinning digital humanities culturally aware? Does the field's emphasis on open access and open data perpetuate a neo-colonial agenda? And with that, we'll conclude our korero and leave you with those questions to ponder, if not, develop further in our question period. Ngā mihi nui, kia ora tātou.
Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou, thank you very much. Can we open it up for questions? We'll have 5 minutes questions now, and then we will have more time for questions for link together the across the projects a little bit later. So please, opening it up for questions now. Can I maybe start us with a question? And this is maybe particularly to Rere-No-A-Rangi. Was there reluctance from the iwi and hapu to working with Victoria University of Wellington, Te Herenga Waka, on data, or was it more a broader issue of kind of building relationships?
Yeah, more the latter there, I think, as you alluded to, Donald. I think as this project has developed, we have consistently said the most valuable thing that we have is our relationships, more so than our data, and possibly more so than the code that we've been writing. Mainly because the relationships that we get established, they've shown time and time and again that we get thrown talent, we get thrown opportunities, we get thrown, as Sydney mentioned about the LINS relationship and where that set us. So when it came to PKW, it was more about establishing that relationship. And when it came to sharing data, I guess the ideas of sovereignty remained wholly with those whose sovereignty it is to make the decision. And so what I mean is that what we were going to do or how we were going to look after it, that was all determined by PKW and by proxy as shareholders and my whānau. And that was what our, I guess, methodologies have been. Well, those are the tikanga that we've carried through. We followed that as opposed to other ways looking that might be correct or maybe more complex, but also not from the community we're working with.
We have time for one more question, and Chris has posted one. I don't know if you can see that on your screen there. Do you have particular tikanga you use when working with this data?
I could start with the opening one, that in general, we're very careful with republishing the data that we have used in the project. The particular example in Roku that was used was from Rere's family, and the little piece of the PKW data that is from out of his whānau. And that's perhaps the most obvious tikanga.
Yes, and the opening slide for Pikihuia's video is a whakatauki that was gifted to the project by the previous shareholder manager at PKW, Mitchell Ritai, and the image gifted it to us by Shane Hansen, a Taranaki-based artist. So that frames all of our engagement with the public, if you want to call it that. It frames the way we do things. We have a set of tikanga and kawa that govern what we do, everything from data storage through to managing, through to our Friday kai and kororo sessions, which are our team meetings, through to the ways in which we share our findings with the public. A particular example of that is the journal article that's cited on the last slide for an international journal of data mining and digital humanities that came back to us after the peer review and said to us, where's your data? We ask everyone who submits to our journal to make their data open and share it. So we had to add and reiterate in great detail a paragraph that explained why the data wasn't open, who it belonged to, and as Rhys mentioned, the examples that we gave in that article are all of those whānau related to the project team members.
Yeah, it's much easier to to call up your auntie or be you know, responsible by your nana or somebody else in your whānau, rather than researching about somebody else. And you know, and not to say that I guess what I mean is putting yourself in a predicament that you're not covered by your own people. I guess that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
We have another question about ethics from Alyssa Pacey, but let's hold that for the discussion at the end because I'm conscious of time. But kia ora koutou, thank you very much for that. If I could ask everyone to do a bit of digital clapping. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Donald.
Now, Pikihuia Reihana is our next presenter. Are you ready to go, Pikihuia? You're muted at the moment.
I'm not able to start my video, Donald.
Okay.
Turn on my screen.
Caleb, are you able to help with that?
Your permission should be enabled. Let me give me a minute. Nice. Oh, there you go.
I'm here.
Excellent. Welcome.
Okay, 1 minute.
So Pikihuia's title is Intellectual Property, Data, Sovereignty and Action, a contribution to global conversations. And here we are, screen shared. Excellent.
Nei rā te mihi ki a koe te tia mana o te kaupapa nei. He mihi tēnei ki a koutou e hono ipurangi nei ki ngā mata o ngā maunga. Just gonna move something here. Sorry, 1 minute. Ko wai au, e noho ana au kei raro o ngā maunga teitei, ko hikurangi, ko te awa pūtahi, ko te tapuwai o uanuku, ko auraki. He uri au no Ngāti Kahu, no Ngāti Hine, no Ngāti Kahununu, no Rangitāne, no Ngaitahu. Kei konei au, ko Pikihuia Reihana tōku ingoa. Kia ora koutou katoa. It's my privilege to be able to connect with you today in this virtual digital humanities space and to kōrero with you about my rangahau and mahi. I'll start by sharing with you a little bit about myself, where I've come from and where I'm going. I want to acknowledge also my, my friends, my colleagues, the researchers on Kimihia Te Matangaro, because that's a space where I have been for a short while. But I want to whakamana their work by saying that they are really the ones doing the heavy lifting. I think I've been there just to keep them company. Heoi anō, it's because of that piece of work, Kimihia Te Matangaro, that I'm finding my own voice. So my PhD research and metaphorical maunga is grounded in Māori data and its source of strength, such as Māori thriving as translators of the metaphorical, Māori thriving when they whakaaro Māori, and Māori as storytellers within their own context. My interest is a continuance of kaupapa Māori research in and out of the workplace, as well as growing matatou raronga Māori, Māori data literacy. So this whakatauki provides a framework in which to ground this contribution to a global conversation about intellectual property and attribution. It also provides a lens to enable a conversation about mobilising and operationalising Māori data sovereignty. This kōrero is grounded in and privileges tirohanga Māori, a Māori lens, and therefore a Māori worldview. So this is my context and this is my story. A little bit of context about this humanities problem. During the early stages of a business transformation project, I was involved in a kōrero about co-design methodologies. I asked that the model I had shared during the kōrero not be included in any documentation at the time. However, weeks later, the model was visualised in an online presentation where there were in excess of 100 staff logged in. I saw my words appear on screen. They were my words exactly. I knew this instinctively because the nuances and the intent were a reflection of my own. And I wondered how my words landed in the presentation without my consent. And whilst I knew they were my words, I couldn't provide immediate evidence. And I reacted to what I read. So this is largely my reaction. Central to my kōrero today is this model. And if you attempted to take a screenshot or a photo, let me tell you something. This model and the lack of attribution is the central motivator of this kōrero. The model is a representation of personal data that's grounded in kaupapa Māori theory, supported by Māori data sovereignty principles. It provides a platform for me to engage in this digital humanities kaupapa. It's founded on interlocking and repeatable processes that are both linear and cyclical. It was originally developed as a model for engagement, design, and development, and it attempts to claim a space for Māori voices and perspectives. There are actually a number of lenses through which Māori data sovereignty is explored, the first of which is kaupapa Māori theory. It's a lens that helps understand the Māori ways of being, knowing and understanding, and this lens is pivotal to this kōrero. Founders Graham Smith and Linda Tuhiwai Smith have individually and jointly lectured and written extensively on kaupapa Māori, both as a theory and a practice, and these are the 6 guiding principles. The model is the result of a convergence of ideas, my life experiences, whānau, as well as theorists and practitioners working with Māori data, frameworks, and te reo Māori language revitalisation experts. These are individuals and groups who have influenced my thinking and shaped my understanding of things kaupapa Māori. Turning now to the model, whakamohio, ko wai, no wai, hiaha and hiaha ai. These are scene-setting questions. These are engagement-oriented questions that encourage whanaungatanga, networking and collaboration. I refer to the Manamahi framework and the care and fair principles as they support scene-setting and engagement. They are both people and purpose-oriented. Whakamārama, keihea, āhea and pēhea. These information-seeking questions are designed to deepen understanding of a kaupapa. Participants are able to categorise, theme and prioritise, as well as subscribe to various ways of thinking, doing and understanding. Atawhai Tibble and his 5 whys model provide additional context in this space. Whakaaro. Whakaaro is to wānanga, to dream, to imagine and to innovate. Here new possibilities are born and debated. I think about kākano, a seed that is to be nurtured and protected. As the plant grows, it is exposed to the elements, much like colleagues and conferences like this. From the kākano, new growth emerges, either in isolation or as a part of a cluster, a pāharakeke. A pāharakeke may be likened to a hapu or iwi. It's a collection of whānau. Harakeke is often used as a metaphor for whānau. At the centre of the harakeke is the rito, the child. Like any child, it requires protection by its parents. They are the awhi rito. The outer leaves, the tupuna, are the older parts of the plant. These leaves are harvested and repurposed. Whakamahia is about doing the work. Continuing with the harakeke metaphor, the terms haro and hapine are used to describe scraping and softening. Perhaps this is synonymous with the massaging of thoughts, deciding what we like, what we don't like, eliminating flaws. Aho and whenu are the strands upon which ideas are linked or connected. We know that as researchers, academics and writers, we take time to listen and to talk. Images, models, diagrams, artistic works, etc. are used to facilitate and deepen understanding. We cite our sources, which may be accompanied by captions, permissions for use, etc. These are not specifically kaupapa Māori practices, but they are good practices nonetheless. Whakamatau is about doing the right thing and doing the thing right, to affirm, to validate, and to verify. Again, continuing with the harakeke metaphor, whatu and whiri are joining processes, whereas mawhiti and huka are the embellishments. The end product embodies the aspirations of those who contributed to its design and creation. So looking forward, since the problem arose, the inadvertent sharing of the model, I've had a number of conversations with individuals and program management about intellectual property, attribution, training, and operationalization. These conversations have led to our co-designing a data sovereignty and action practice that is ongoing but requires celebration and acknowledgement of originality, the provision of evidence of ideas, both your own and others, and that we need to be better researchers. When we whakamana others, we whakamana ourselves. The model was bookended by whakapapa and whakaako. Whakapapa is present in everything. It is inscribed in virtually every aspect of tirohanga Māori, and it is through whakapapa that Māori position themselves within their ao. Whakapapa emphasises the importance of original thought and traceability. Perhaps this is not too different to provenance. Whakaako, on the other hand, refers to continuous learning, ako atu, ako mai, as well as the agility to adjust according to changing requirements and being able to make decisions and to iterate. So whilst I have not resolved the problem, a number of questions remain. What do we understand about operationalising kaupapa Māori principles? How do we reflect the complexity of Māori data sovereignty in our operational practices? How do we acknowledge and give attribution to Māori authors, creators, etc., in and out of the workplace? And to what extent are our operational practices designed to be inclusive of Indigenous cultures? Unfortunately, something has happened and my screen has frozen. But we carry on, don't we? As a researcher, I have an opportunity to affirm and validate tirohanga Māori and to critique Pākehā construction of Māori. So regardless of our cultural differences, there are so many things we see through the same lens. He paku kōrero tāku, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Back to you.
Ora Pikihuia, thank you. I'd like to open it up again for 5 minutes of questions. You can either type them, or if you'd like to unmute your microphone, please go ahead. You've got the whakaaro going deep. We'll maybe just give it another few seconds if people are forming a question, and then we can connect Pikihuia's presentation with the others towards the end. So I think is that Chris a question there, or is it? Oh no, sorry, that's a comment on the previous presentation. All right, let's.
I think there's someone's got a hand up.
Thank you, Ripeka. Please go ahead.
Oh, tēnā koe, tēnā koutou ngā mātua, ngā whaia ka hui atu ki tēnei wā. I don't really have a question. I feel this is such a privilege to listen and participate in this experience. I merely just want to mihi atu ki Pikihuia as haukainga, as whānau to Pikihuia, I roto i tana mea mahi. Yeah, tēnā koutou, tēnā koe Pikihuia, kia ora rau.
Kia ora, Ripeka. I think I have to take your hand down, or you've done it yourself. Oh, excellent. That's as you're thinking, responding to Pikihuia's presentation. We'll listen to Sarah Thomasson next, and then come in and weave our thoughts together for whakaaro in relation to all the presentations. So kia ora Pikihuia no. Sarah, are you ready to start?
Yes, I'll just share my screen.
Excellent.
Great. Ko Sarah Thomasson, taku whenua. No te papaka a Māori oku te puna, kei te noho oki te whanganui a tara. A I'd like to pay my respects to the mana whenua of my adoptive country of Aotearoa and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land of my home country of Australia and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Indigenous peoples here today and listening to the recording. The Australasian performing arts ecology is enriched by trans-Tasman touring circuits that facilitate cultural exchange between Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia. How can we use digital humanities tools and methodologies to shift the scale of analysis from individual performances to their transnational flows? How do we quantify, and map these touring networks to understand and interrogate the cultural work that these flows produce? And this is an example from another project where I was mapping the tours of the National Theatre of Scotland that came to this part of the world. The first step is to quantify this data within a live performing arts database. In this paper, I outline a project to document Aotearoa's diverse performance tradition by building communities, consulting widely with local stakeholders, including artists, live performing arts companies, researchers, experts from the GLAM sector in Indigenous data sovereignty and digital humanities, and by collaborating with Ozstage partners in Australia to develop a live performing arts database for Aotearoa. My colleague James Wenley and I are undertaking this project that aims, in collaboration with many others, that aims to honour Aotearoa's Te Tiriti partnership in the creation of digital infrastructure that supports, preserves and promotes performing arts research. Part of the impetus of the project, which I'm going to flag only began at the start of the month, is to preserve and extend the 20-year legacy of our colleague, Professor Lisa Warrington, who established the Theatre Aotearoa database at the University of Otago in 2004. Warrington, who has now retired, has created a database of over 18,000 entries of New Zealand performances of theatre, opera, musical theatre, ballet, contemporary dance, radio drama, site-specific performances and rehearsed readings between 1841 and 2005. This is an enormous gift to scholarship with each entry, and this is an example, detailing the kind of information that you would expect to find within theatrical programs, including dates, venues, lists of casts and creators for New Zealand work performed here and overseas. The database also includes further information on where to find reviews and articles relating to these performances, which has been painstakingly compiled from personal and institutional collections of programs, newspaper clippings, defunct journals and trade magazines, and a range of archival material. Unfortunately, this database is running on old software that can no longer be supported, leading colleagues from Otago to reach out to Ozstage, the Australian Live Performing Arts database, who in turn contacted us. And I just want to take a moment here to acknowledge the mahi of colleagues from the Otago University Library, and I think some of them are here today, Charlotte Brown and Alexander Ritchie, and Jenny Fuster, previously of Ozstage and now of the ARDC, who have already invested so much time in this project to seek sustainable solutions to preserve this valuable archive of theatre in Aotearoa. There is a long tradition in our region of the transnational movement of artists, companies and theatrical performance between Aotearoa and Australia, albeit hampered a little bit lately. The contemporary trans-Tasman touring circuit has been built on the historical legacy of commercial theatre producers and venue operators, such as J.C. Williamson's in the 19th and 20th centuries. So the overlapping data and close disciplinary ties mean that it makes sense to collaborate with Ozstage to preserve the Theatre Aotearoa legacy data and to ensure that the FAIR principles are implemented within a plan for sustainable data stewardship. Importantly and more immediately, though, we'll consult widely with New Zealand artists and companies to ensure that the database infrastructure can be adapted to best serve the needs of our diverse communities. In adapting or perhaps reviving a theatre database for Aotearoa, we have the opportunity to implement the CARE principles from the beginning of the project to ensure that they are operationalised across the data management lifecycle. To this end, consultation, but hopefully also collaboration with Māori artists and performing arts companies is fundamental to developing best practice protocols to respect and empower Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. I want to briefly outline what we see as the value of the project and what it can offer arts and scholarship in Aotearoa to outline the implications of Indigenous data sovereignty for the project, and to conclude with an example of the new avenues for performing arts research that are enabled by digital humanities tools and methodologies. aaDH is a collaboratively constructed relational database that captures and stores live performing arts events data and makes this information freely accessible online. Expanding the platform to capture New Zealand data respects the whakapapa of live performing arts practices in Aotearoa and recognises the depth and scope of theatre, dance, circus, cabaret and Maori and Pacifica performing arts over time. Without such a database, the details of these ephemeral events are at risk of being lost or left inaccessible in disparate physical collections across different institutions, or even more precariously within the personal scrapbooks and program collections of theatre enthusiasts. And this is an example of an aaDH entry. Archiving these data and making them freely accessible online will provide a service to artists and companies to document their work, and will enable interested parties to search the production histories of playtexts or look up their favourite actors or directors, for example. By quantifying and aggregating this data, researchers will be able to identify trends and gaps, assess the impact of government policy or perhaps an external shock like a global health pandemic, map tours and networks, or visualise complex patterns of collaboration. Quantitative data enables macro-analysis or distant reading in Rere-No's terms that can be combined with close performance analysis to ask new questions and yield innovative results. A theatre database will necessarily encompass a hybrid data set incorporating Indigenous and non-Indigenous data, and will therefore be fundamentally shaped by Indigenous data sovereignty and evolving guidance on how to implement the care principles. This has wide-reaching implications for how we adapt the aaDH database infrastructure, oversee data collection and management, and formulate processes for data stewardship in the long term. Stephanie Russo-Carroll and her co-authors point to a tension between the push for open data that is machine readable and Indigenous rights and interests in data. In addition to restricting access to sensitive data and respecting privacy, they outline the need to manage the process of giving or refusing consent and call for researchers to be aware of actions to take before engaging with Indigenous data anywhere along the data lifecycle. Protocols will not just be needed for data collection and entry, but for researchers wanting to use the data and reuse the data. In the case of Indigenous data or hybrid data, as Carroll et al. Signal, there is a need to ensure that data are not only fair, but that they align with Indigenous rights, this is a quote, as open, as determined by Indigenous communities, are purposeful and enhance the well-being of Indigenous peoples. We do believe that a live performing arts database can positively impact Indigenous as well as non-Indigenous artists, companies and researchers, and can contribute to Mātauranga Māori by providing tools to document and celebrate diverse performance traditions. Collecting data on the rich whakapapa of Indigenous performing arts can ensure that the mana of artists is upheld as long as the data are used to, quote, serve Indigenous social and cultural interests or purposes. Therefore, it is the responsibility of researchers, in the words of Carroll et al., to engage respectfully with these communities to ensure that the use of Indigenous data supports capacity development. They also warn of the need not to shy away from this responsibility by leaving Indigenous data aside, because, quote, exclusion of Indigenous data essentially raises Indigenous peoples and interests from data-related futures. While protocols for implementing the care principles are evolving, this project will be guided by the three sub-principles of Te Mana Rarunga Māori Data Sovereignty Network, which are control, jurisdiction, and self-determination. Tahu Kukatai and Donna McCormack, from earlier in the week, articulate these as Māori control over Māori, data and ecosystems, decision-making over data storage, and Indigenous rights to data that support self-determination and self-governance. So these are the principles that we will take forward into our consultation process, and as this process must be Indigenous-led, we will start by looking for more collaborators in this space. I want to conclude here by foreshadowing the ways in which the Live Performing Arts database, which is interoperable with aaDH and its international partners, provides quantitative data for analysis using digital humanities approaches. My area of research is arts festivals, and I'm particularly interested in how the international arts festivals in both countries work together to facilitate the movement of theatrical performance into and out of the region. Very simply, these graphs represent the festival data that prove my hypothesis that these events are sharing product and that there are different degrees of relationship between the individual events. This is one example of the potential that digital humanities offer performing arts researchers in a field ordinarily beholden to close analysis of performance texts, to ask new research questions and explore new methodologies. In bringing together communities of artists and researchers from across the Tasman, this project seeks creative and sustainable digital solutions to capture data on inherently ephemeral events and to better understand the impact of these transnational flows and relationships.
Gotta thank you very much, Sarah. I could encourage people to give Sarah a clappy reaction. Kia ora. And I'll now open it up for questions. So there's a question there. I don't know if you can see that, Sarah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Who puts the data in? Yes. So I guess assuming that we proceed on the stage model, it's open contribution, so Creative Commons. We usually, I think there's a login if you want to get involved, and hopefully people will want to get involved and give some guidance on how to do the data entry. It's not quite as easy as, well, I have no idea how people get data into IMDb or something like that, for example, but there's a little bit of guidance, but essentially anybody who wants to can get some training and can put data in, and we'd really love for people to contribute.
Did you see the follow-up question there? Is it a wiki-based project?
I don't believe so. Jenny might be able to help me here if I get... No, it's not. There you go.
I have a question just while others are thinking. Do you see this kind of a tool can gather quite fine-grained data? Do you see it as gathering data right down to the level of kind of gigs at pubs and other things that are, you used the word ephemera before, so that it's things that are invisible to a kind of in a high cultural lens?
Definitely, and so we'd like to get a broad coverage ideally, and if there's, depending on what the community wants, that's what we'd really like. So we'll probably start with the professional companies who might have a little bit more ability to contribute and put their data in, and they might have archives ready to go. But very much it's Amateur Dramatic Society are on our hit list. And also just if you're an artist and you are doing a gig down the pub, definitely want to see that data in the database.
Excellent, thank you. It looks from the chat that you need to connect with Chris, who's very keen. So I'll let you do that off channel or back channel. We'll now hand over, thank you very much, Sarah. We'll now hand over to Tyne. Kia ora, Tyne. It's talking about the Australian Cultural Data Engine.
Thanks, Donald. I'll just make sure I can share. Is that all working?
Looking good.
Great, thank you. Kia ora. Hello, everyone. I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the lands on which I work and do everything else. And I pay my deepest respects to the custodians of this land that I'm privileged to be on and their elders past and present. I'm going to talk to you and tell you all about today a very, very new, actually very preliminary new data-driven project, an Australian Research Council project called the Australian Cultural Data Engine for Research, Industry and Government, which is now coming to be affectionately known as the Engine. So this is which isn't a word we often use in the humanities, so it's been interesting. This is a 2-year collaborative research and engagement project, part of the Linkage Infrastructure, Equipment and Facilities Scheme. And it's based at the University of Melbourne with partners all around Australia and a partner at King's College, London in the UK. And my role on this project is that of Cultural Data Research Fellow. So working with a small team based at the Digital Studio at the University of Melbourne under the direction of CI Professor Rachel Fensham. And so the key innovation of this project, and again, it's only just started, so this is all very preliminary, is to harness leading cultural databases in Australia in visual and performing arts, architecture, humanities and social sciences, and heritage to try to build a bridge to industry and government. And so our running, I guess, mantra in this project thus far is putting cultural data to work. And by that we mean the obvious, in that Australian cultural data has enormous potential, not just for individual researchers working in concentrated areas of art history or the kinds of theatre networks Sarah was just speaking about, but also for putting it in front of governments and industry partners at a really crucial time when the arts have been, as we all know, absolutely battered. So returning to these databases in new ways to think about how they demonstrate substantive and really clear economic well-being, environmental and diplomatic and power relations in the arts and wider sector. So we aim to unify and expand disparate data. And we're working with a range of collaborators on this engine, from well-known arts performance databases through to, such as Ozstage, through to perhaps lesser known collections that nevertheless have really strong and important social and data and scholarly histories and capabilities. So just to very quickly walk you through those, the data we're working with and the project partners are Ozstage, the Australian Women's Register, Circus Oz Living Archive, the Co-op, which is at Swinburne University, the Design and Art Australia Online, just in the middle there, Digital Archive of Queensland Architecture, King's Lab in the UK that I mentioned, the Theatre and Dance Platform, Time-Laid Cultural Map, which many of you will be very familiar with, and the West Australian Folklore Archive. So with this very diverse range of cultural data and ambitiously in the short amount of time available on the project, we want to scope out the shape, current state and collaborative and analytical potential across these various databases and think about what they might actually learn from each other through this project. So to give you just one example of that, the Circus Oz Living Archive, which was developed by an ARC linkage led by David Carlin from 2010 to 2014, is very one of its kind insofar as it presents and represents a totally unique living cluster of stories and videos in a really internationally significant way. So it showcases videos, performances and photos and so on from the performing arts company Circus Oz. And it includes, just as one example, the capacity for granular annotations of performance videos and the sharing and cross-referencing of stories and memories. So part of the project is to really think about these distinctive capabilities and histories. And we want to surface and socialize the unique capabilities at a really timely moment for the arts. And part of this too, which speaks to some of the comments of the earlier speakers on this panel, is to actually think more about concepts of locality and smallness and actually subjectivity of data, cultural data, to push back against some of the more extractive, big-scale methodologies and trends, and to think through these various collections with the CIs about the situatedness of cultural data and its deep connection to people and place and their own individual stories, which are no less significant than the large-scale analysis we hope to be able to do to put in the hands of government. So some of our questions are, you know, who is participating in arts and cultural activity in Australia? How are they going about it? And how can analysis of these trends inform future funding and policy and government support for the arts? A lot of this work has been done through Australia Council reports and other sources, and these are very much in view for the project. But we also want to think about questions of access and use, reciprocity and recognition, which will involve some qualitative analysis too. So talking to those who use these databases, thinking about interviews with artists, for example, who have contributed their stories. And another factor in this is, of course, the way that we have seen this sector transformed in a really unexpected and unprecedented way. So in a recent Australia Council report, 2021, called In Real Life, Mapping Digital Cultural Engagement in the First Decades of the 21st Century, we see summaries of the way that even up-to-date data is now needing to respond to the transition to online platforms, live streaming of festivals and so on. The kind of engagement that we've all been enjoying, but also grappling with for the last couple of years. And I'll just read out two quotes on this that speak to some of the more contemporary parts of the project that I thought were quite interesting. The report states that digital disruption has reorganized the cultural value chain, disrupting linear relationships between creation, production, and distribution, and encouraging peer-to-peer systems of evaluation, reward, and artistic development. So thinking about whether Australian cultural databases might respond to the ways in which people now increasingly expect to be participatory in arts and cultural engagement, not just passive. And the second one, which I'll just kind of speak to, is the idea that whole ecosystems of arts engagement have always existed between corporate and critical modes in this kind of liminal space. However, the opportunities and participatory nature of the digital arena have expanded them like never before and enabled them to influence more mainstream forms of consumption. So I wanted to just read that to you because it kind of speaks to the ways that in this project, we want to think about taking cultural data and putting it in different kinds of hands, not just that of researchers, but those whose stories are actually, and family lineages and so on, are actually reflected in these databases. All of this really important work follows in the footsteps of a lot of serious thinkers who have been working in this space for some time, scholars such as Tully Barnett, Julian Merrick, Ben Eltham, Natalia Grincheva, and Deb Verhoeven's work. And it's also important that it draws on socioeconomic inflections, such as the work of David Throsby, performance by Julie Hollidge and Joanne Tompkins, and the work of Anne Marsh, whose recent book, just in the middle here, Doing Feminism, represents over 220 artists and groups, punctuated by extracts from artist statements, curatorial writing, and critique. There are also other important texts that we're engaging with, being attentive to questions of gender diversity in cultural databases, looking into the future, studies such as the Countess Report. And just quickly, the text on the right here, which is a very recent one by Lev Manovich, signals new directions for thinking about cultural data analytics. In an earlier piece leading into this book, Manovich asks, for example, how can we combine the analysis of larger patterns with the analysis of individual artifacts and their details? How can computational analysis do justice to variability and diversity of cultural artifacts and processes, rather than just focusing on the typical or the most popular? So to wrap up this brief talk, these kinds of questions, these kinds of texts and scholars inform our project as we start the process of using the various cultural data I've just walked you through just to rethink the distinctiveness of cultural data in Australia, and also to think about what it means to work across databases that previously haven't had a lot to do with each other. What can they learn from each other? So just a final quick word on methodology. Even in this early stage, we're thinking around some of the project's data and have settled in many conversations and workshopping exercises on these 4 thematics, each of which we hope speaks to the deep history of arts and culture in Australia, but also to pressing contemporary questions around gender diversity in the arts, power, climate change, soft power in times of crisis, and the importance of maintaining local scenes of experimentation through pockets of funding and so on. So I'll leave it at that for now. That's a very brief crash course in a very new project, but please be in touch if any of this sparks interest for you. And I look forward to showing you more about this, hopefully this time next year in person when it is a bit further along.
Thank you very much, Tyne. You could please say thank you to her. Your reactions. So we have one request for some titles from Marnie there.
Sure.
But I'll let you do that while in a minute. First, if you wanted to engage us. Oh, here's another question. Are you looking to add more collections from Gavin?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yes, we are. So what we're currently doing is looking at the possibilities and perhaps the gaps in the core data that we have access to through the project collaborators, and then through the research questions and, for instance, the various PhD candidates and other researchers we're working with, is to ask questions around other gaps that exist. So, for instance, there are various collections that are just on the cusp of digitisation that we might bring into view if possible and easily accessible. But we're also doing a bit of work, well, actually quite a bit of work in thinking about Australian Bureau of Statistics data in relation to this very specific cultural data. So that hopefully can come into view. It's very thorny and complex and not entirely easy to get one's hands on, but that's just one example of other kinds of data, collections that we're looking to bring in for this project, particularly to interface the cultural with, as I said, the socioeconomic and the more sort of demographic geospatial data that isn't ordinarily used or isn't commonly used in relation to some of this other material. But if you do have ideas, please let me know. Very keen in this project to hear about not just large established collections necessarily, but perhaps researchers who have been working in this space, who have curated data sets that they would love to see socialized further or brought into conversation with other data.
While people are thinking up their questions, could I ask another one? You mentioned in relation to performers, I think, or artists, reciprocity. Can you say a bit more what you meant by reciprocity with those in the creative sector?
Absolutely. Great question again. We're thinking about the ways that different, particularly critical and scholarly, but other kinds of curatorial events, whether they be let's say book collections that appear in museums and so on, have used these cultural databases, whether formally or informally, and what it means for better understanding their value and their use. And in particular, when those curatorial events occur, let's say a book that's produced as part of an exhibition that has data we can see in those databases, but researchers or artists come along and add further material, whether that appears back in those collections themselves. So by reciprocity, really thinking about, can we trace and better understand the 360 data model for these collections that are being used, but not perhaps necessarily formally cited, or whether the trajectory of research that's being conducted is being traced back to them in certain kinds of ways. And what it means then to actually establish methods and potential funding to put that data back in, particularly if there are high-profile publications or events.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for that. I think we can open it up now for more kind of general questions, unless there's something else you wanted to add, Tyne, before you share the stage.
No, thank you. Other than thank you to the other panelists. It was a real privilege to hear the first two papers and Sarah's, and see the threads across them. So I'll just now busily type these book titles in the chat. Been trying to double task and hand it back over to you.
Oh, thank you. So if I could ask the other presenters to, well, you don't need to unmute immediately, but to kind of mentally take the front of the stage again. Do you have any questions of each other? Are there connections between your projects that you noticed, or particular things that you're interested in, connections between the projects?
Kia ora, Sarah. A question for you. And it might very well be related to a question for Tyne. Off-the-shelf databases, ones that already have inscribed in their structures and in their ways of accessing, surfacing information, etc. When you're working with, as you mentioned, Sarah, potentially Indigenous performing groups, etc., will there be a disconnect between the kinds of data, quote unquote, that you'll want to put in that database and the frictions that emerge because of the way that that database structures that information in ways that don't necessarily reflect an Indigenous worldview or indeed Indigenous data sovereignty? Kia ora.
In short, yes. I envisage that being a huge part of this conversation and consultation process, and that's why we're very early in our project, and it's why we're hoping to kind of reach out to people here and make connections. Obviously, we've got lots of connections in the art space, and we're sure that our community will be able to inform us. But this is, yes, I've been doing a lot of reading over the last few weeks, and even just what is data and who owns data. And actually, Sydney, if it's okay with you, I was hoping after the conference that I might reach out to you and have a chat about this in more detail. Terence actually suggested when we met with him that we get in contact with you.
Do you have any sort of thoughts about that question yourself and the work that you're doing with your cultural data engine?
The only thought I've had, thanks for the question, is this idea of who's doing the work to put the sort of data back in the context of this project already. We're really discovering the scarcity of knowledge and skills when it comes to understanding the distinctness of the data, and the fact that you sort of, even if you were to come across open off-the-shelf data that you might just put in, it needs to speak to the, I suppose, ideological and historical ways in which these distinct databases have been constructed from the outset. To give you just one example, the Circus Oz that I mentioned is very much about kind of creating and recreating memories, and the idea of, well, were you actually there? Do you remember what it was like when this particular performance occurred in, someone's backyard in 1992, or on this, at this particular theatre in 2001, and that the kind of curatorial process has to be attentive to those really specific contexts and memories and so on. And also thinking across the databases whether they update themselves in certain ways isn't an easy task either, because different categories, titles like artist can mean very different things in an architecture database as to what they mean in, you know, a theatre and arts and performing arts database. So really encountering those questions as well. As soon as we leap into these big, ambitious goals to build and expand and, you know, make interoperable, you're confronted back again with the smallness and the particularity of cultural data. So it's always about kind of, yeah, being very aware of that tension, and also being very aware of the particular histories and real thinking that went into them at their kind of conception.
Tēnā pe he pātai mōu Pikihuia he oi ka timata ki te mihi i tō kōrero i o whakaro meo pātai nui nui rawa I oti I a koe te tuku. One of the last questions you left us with was, how do we operationalize the principles of Māori data sovereignty? And I was thinking about that. And my response to that would be, it's always contextual. There's no particular way, and I think that's one of the things that we've experienced in our work and with other people that we've worked with. And there isn't a way. It's about the relationships. It's about the process. It's everything leading up until the point at which you operationalize those principles. I just wondered if you had any kōrero about that, or yeah, tēnā koe.
If I think about the Kopapa Māori by design model, what I'm actually saying is that it has to start with Kopapa Māori in mind, as opposed to applying some indigenous, some cultural ways of thinking further down the track. It needs to actually start at that point. And hence there's a lot of emphasis on that engagement part of the process. Whakamohio and whakamārama, it's taking time to dive deep into who and what and why you're doing the mahi that you're doing. But the whakapapa of that is it sits on a continuous it sits on a continuum, and you have to keep going back and reminding yourself, hence being able to, so anytime you do something, you need to be able to trace it back to the people and the purpose for the mahi. And that's what I'm experiencing in the business transformation work that I'm doing at the moment, where we want to understand all of those data sources sitting in our data ecosystem. But if we don't have the right people on board, then you know, it's really easy to just do the work in isolation, but actually we do better when we work as whānau. So we've got to bring our people on board with us and take them on that journey, but it's got to start with them. It can't just be something we add in later on.
Kia ora.
Koina taku. I've got a question for Tyne. Did I say that right?
Yeah, thank you.
It was about, I was really interested in actually in what your framework is for working with all of those different cultures. What's your approach to that before you even get to doing the mahi?
Yeah. Very early stage. So trying to think through, in particular, I mentioned gender because one of our key themes, thematics we're working on first is, you know, the role of gender diversity in the arts and kind of rethinking power structures and influences, is to be guided by the most recent principles and reports that have been produced by diverse gender people and various groups that have been embedded in the arts and cultural scene themselves and have experienced the scene as artists, as practitioners and performers. So in terms of a very early kind of, I guess, methodological framework is to in response to your question, is to really try and be led by those who have produced the work themselves that has subsequently appeared in the databases. So to come back to, you know, thinking about people in place before big data analytics and being led by those principles. At the University of Melbourne, we also have the Indigenous Data Network, so very much guided by the CARE principles and protocols developed by that important research group, as well as questions of gender and other metadata considerations. But even in this panel, there's been so much to take away just from listening to your talks that we can think on with this project, because it is so big and we are moving across, as you said, all these different kind of forms, trying to make connections between them, but also understand that they have distinct histories that are, connected to particular kinds of social and cultural belief systems that were there from the first creation of the data. So nothing formalized yet, but getting towards something.
Oh, kia ora. We can help you with that, eh?
I'd love to chat more.
Kia ora, Tyne. Thank you.
Thank you.
That takes us back to an earlier question. I think where all these issues interconnect. I think it was Chris who asked earlier about privacy and other ethical issues of Rere-No-A-Rangi and his team. Can I ask you to respond to that? So how do you reconcile collecting personal information with privacy, confidentiality, and the ethical parameters of that?
Right. We're using information from organizations, Crown organizations in the form of DIA for birth-test marriages, the Maori Land Court for Māoriland online information, LINZ for their data, and also from the Pikihuia Reihana Corporation, which is a Maori incorporation. Their formal positions, what we understand of it, are remarkably similar in that they have a notion of a document of record. So, the court, what we have accessible to us is firstly information that you can see on a screen, but behind that it is the record of the court, and it is a court of record. In other words, the court is a public forum of a particular sort. The register that Pikihuia Reihana keeps is a record, and again, it's a public record, formally speaking. The DIA keeps the register of births, deaths, and marriages. It's a record. It's an administrative record of an agency. So underneath, I think underneath the data that we're using is this is an old understanding of what a formal record is, of essentially public information. But what's so interesting from our point of view is that the outlook and the approach of those different agencies has been very, very different. So Paranihiki Waitotara, as you'd expect, regard their register as a taonga. And so they wish to see that it's treated very carefully and very respectfully. The Department of Internal Affairs regard births, deaths and marriages as something that's sufficiently important that they need their own act to cover access to it. And it is minutely detailed over the prerogatives of the registrar. LINs regard the information that they've collected as not only public, but open. And to the greatest extent possible, they license it for reuse. Have we done them all?
Māoriland.
The court. The Ministry of Justice is a kind of bicameral organisation. You have the judges, the legislature on the one side, and you have the bureaucrats on the other side. Whether they can have enough of a conversation between the two halves of the ministry and the two perspectives, legislative on the one hand, or judicial, and the state or administrative on the other, whether they can manage a conversation about the status of data and whether or not privacy is any kind of a consideration. It would appear that there are those conversations. There have been ongoing conversations for a long time, but we are not really privy to them. So what we're doing in the meantime is we're leaning on our status as researchers. We're hoovering up information. If it's on a screen somewhere and there's lots of it and it's relevant to our project, we will ask for it or take it, one or the other. But we'll really see ourselves as more than a research organisation. We are in a partnership with Paranihiki Waitotara, and the information that's generated from our project is, we intend to be of benefit for them and of use for them.
And nothing else.
LINs are outstanding that they've really recognised that, and they've extended to PKW a status that recognises that the LINs information that's relevant to PKW that there are interests in that information that belong to PKW. So they've really been the outlier. But as you can see, we're trying not to offend anybody, trying to keep a low profile, trying to keep a lid on our data, but trying to sustain the relationships and the conversations as we work towards some understanding of where we will be when the project finishes.
And certainly,
thank you, Rhys.
I can add one point to that, please. If I might.
Yeah, we have 1 minute to go. Sure.
Yeah, this will be quick. So the one point is that in terms of the privacy legislation, we've been talking to people from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. It's all predicated upon individual privacy, individual ownership of data. There is no construct to understand collectivity. So what is collective ownership? What is collective privacy? So we're running right against what does that mean in a Te Ao Māori setting? So even talking about privacy, one has to qualify what that means. That's my bit. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much, everyone. We're just on 5:30, so we'll need to bring it to a close because computers don't let us go over time. Thank you. They remind you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to all the 25 or so, 20 people listening. Thank you to the participants. and look forward to seeing you. There's a social event coming up at 6 p.m. Chaired by Dave Chikoreko, who is fantastic at running these things. And we reconvene tomorrow at 2 p.m. Please have a look at your schedule. There's some fantastic stuff there. But for now, thank you, everyone. Ka kite anō. See you again.
Thanks all.